Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Let us know if you've had this experience. So you grow up in this country, you're maybe a Republican voter or a mild conservative in the sense that you don't want to change everything overnight. You're just instinctively distrustive of revolution. You're going about your business, raising a family, working at a job, all the while thinking that basically big companies are fundamentally on your side, not in every detail, but they're not actively working to, say, destroy your family or wreck your country. And then you wake up in the morning and realize, wait, actually they are. They're changing this country. The changes that I'm seeing are being led not necessarily by the federal government, but by private, publicly held companies that are effectively calling for revolution in the American social order, though not the economic order. What is that? Where does that come from? We've noticed this for years now. Hard to get your hands around it because it's such a big phenomenon, and yet there is a remarkable similarity to the way these companies behave. Whether it's generational stalwarts like Coca-Cola or new companies, new much more obviously radical companies like Twitter, they all have the same priorities. How is that? Is there some club these guys are all a member of? It's not Bohemian Grove. What is it? What are these ideas and where do they come from? So we've been spending, the past couple months looking for someone who can explain what the heck is going on with corporate America. And Stephen Sokup is the man. He's the author of a book called The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. He's the publisher of the Political Forum. He joins us now. Steve, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, Tucker. I appreciate it.
So, well, this is just a fascinating subject, and you've really, I think, gotten to the bottom of it. But for our viewers who aren't familiar with you, who are you? Where are you from? How'd you get to where you are now?
Well, I'm nobody, and that's intentionally so.
In other words, you're wise. Okay, you've established that.
I headed out to Washington, like a lot of people, wanting to change the world. Just fresh out of graduate school, I started working.
What did you study in graduate school?
I studied American politics.
Wow.
So I went to work in the Washington research office of a large brokerage house. What we did was try to figure out what's going to happen in Washington and how it might affect equities markets, and to alert our clients as to what was going to happen based on developments in Washington and around the world.
So you look at the Congress, at the White House, and then you get back to your investors and say, here's what the future may hold.
Yes, absolutely. I spent about 4 or 5 years at that big brokerage house working for the guy who essentially invented the discipline of Washington research for Wall Street. His name is Mark Melcher, and he was the biggest and best known Washington research analyst for all of Wall Street. People loved him. They called him Wall Street's philosopher. And he was, as I said, he was the number one rated analyst for years until 2000, when we had been spending quite a bit of time talking about political corruption and about how political corruption was the greatest risk to financial markets for the foreseeable future.
In the United States?
In the United States, absolutely. The United States, we argued, was on the verge of becoming a banana republic. The types of things that went on when Bob Rubin was the Secretary of the Treasury, the types of things that went on while Bill Clinton was president, the entire second term of his presidency was very dangerous, we thought, to the integrity of American business and the integrity of capital markets. Just before the 2000 election.
Interesting. So let me just ask you to pause and say, I covered both terms of the Clinton administration, and there were, we had a lot of concerns about the behavior of those administrations, but I rarely heard any sober person call them corrupt in the sense that you're describing.
Well, the actions that Bob Rubin in particular took with respect to the Mexican peso bailout, and then there was the long-term capital management bailout, and there were a handful of things that bordered on corruption, and our admonition at the time was that we should be careful that getting politics too involved in finance, getting politics too deeply integrated into the capital markets would eventually be a very serious issue. The chairman and CEO of our parent company didn't particularly care for what we were saying, and
why?
Well, he was friendly with
Bob Rubin?
No, actually, with Bill and Hillary Clinton, and took them on his private jet and flew them to the home city and showed them around all the important changes they were making in the home city and how they were trying to improve the city, etc. So he was friendly with them, and he was unhappy with us calling them out. So our firm took the #1 rated analyst, the guy who essentially created the category, and fired him 2 weeks before the 2000 presidential election. 2 weeks before the most important election in our lifetimes at that point.
Well, that's kind of a shocking story.
It is a shocking story, but it goes to show you that they didn't care about what we were saying. They didn't care about research whatsoever. They didn't care about the truth. What they cared about was making the people that they thought were powerful happy. So we ended up essentially...
Which is a sign of corruption right there.
Absolutely.
So if you're investing in capital markets, your primary consideration should be economic factors, right? Is this enterprise growing or not, or whatever the measurements are. It shouldn't be your proximity to power. That is corruption, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we found out very quickly, is that it doesn't matter if you're telling the truth. If the truth is uncomfortable to some people who have enough power to make you uncomfortable for telling it, they will certainly make sure that you suffer the consequences.
Were you shocked by this?
I was shocked. It was very surprising. Plus, I was 28, 29, 30 years old, I don't recall, but I was suddenly out of a job.
So you got canned too?
Well, I got canned too as part of his team. He was the senior analyst, I was his associate analyst, and so I was out on the street as well. And at his age, he got a fairly significant severance buyout, but I didn't. So I was very worried about what would happen. And as it turned out, I made sort of a interesting decision that turned out in the end to be the best decision that I could make, and that's I called one of the other Washington research shops in town and said, hey, look, we just got fired. We can help you. I know you just lost your senior Washington analyst. We can help put your shop back together. And that was the Lehman Brothers Washington office. So we took...
sorry to laugh. Sorry to snicker.
No, listen. No, I can explain.
And that was
it
the
all.
best decision you made?
Listen, we went over to Lehman Brothers, and we worked there for a couple of years.
How many guys went over from your
There were two, just my boss and me. And we went over after 9/11. Terrorism was another issue that we had followed very significantly. The higher-ups at Lehman said, you guys are no longer allowed to talk about terrorism. The only one who speaks for the firm on terrorism is Sandy Berger. They hired Sandy Berger, paying him more than the two of us made for a year. They hired him for a month to talk about terrorism. And we were told you can no longer talk about
Sandy Berger, the former
that.
national security advisor for Bill Clinton.
Right, the guy who hid documents in his socks and walked out.
The disgraced felon, right, yeah.
So he became the firm's spokesman. Over the next several months, as we began to pursue the corruption angle again, we began to write pieces for our clients about the corruption in China and about the risks that were associated with investing in China, because at that point in time, that was the new frontier. All of the investment banks were opening up the new frontier in China, and every time we wrote about it, we were told, we're spiking the piece. The bank is doing deals with the government of China. We have no interest whatsoever in you calling the butchers of Beijing, and warning our clients that there is a risk here. So eventually we ended up quitting and starting.
But how does that serve the clients?
Well, it didn't. It didn't serve the clients at all. It served the investment bank, which is what, as we found out 8 years later or 7 years later, Lehman Brothers was all about. Was doing what they thought was best for the bank.
How did Lehman do in the end?
Well, Lehman did very well in the end. I always think about the Despicable Me. In the first movie, he goes into the secret lair of the Bank of Evil, and the sign pops up. It says, Bank of Evil, parentheses, formerly Lehman Brothers. And I think, I worked there. Yeah, I know that. So we started our own firm, and what we decided to do, me and Melcher, was to tell the truth to our clients. We've spent the last 18 and a half years telling the truth. There's no investment bank to tell us no. There's no headquarters to tell us no. There's nobody to fire us. There's nobody who can do anything other than the two of us. And what we do is we tell our clients the truth.
So you're
about
still
what's
working
going on.
together?
Absolutely.
After how many years?
25 years this past September.
That's amazing.
Yep.
That's wonderful.
That's what I've done. That's how I got to where I'm at, and I've largely been invisible ever since. A small handful of clients who actually believe that the truth matters, who actually believe that the truth can help them get the best returns on investment for their clients, have been our supporters over the years, and that's where we've been. That's what we've been doing.
So it's kind of a philosophical and economic question. Over time, does it produce better returns when you're, a sincere question, when you're reality-based, when you know the truth?
Yeah, I absolutely think it does. For example, we're seeing this right now in China with Evergrande. There are firms, large firms, that are very interested in being more heavily invested in China, that in fact, as Evergrande started to have problems, dumped more money into the company and are now suffering the consequences. You know, just as recently as August, for example, BlackRock was putting more money into Evergrande. And BlackRock is the largest asset management firm in the world with $10 trillion in assets under management. And they are very convinced that China is still the new frontier. And so they were continuing to put money into Evergrande, never contemplating the fact that in a system as corrupt as the People's Republic of China, the companies are going to be as corrupt, and eventually that's going to come back and haunt you.
Interesting. I'm heartened to hear that it's a better bet long term
Absolutely.
to stay rooted in reality. Because at this point, you begin to wonder. I mean, you hear people denying obvious realities. The 2 + 2 = 5 group seem to be richer than ever.
Yes, there are some short-term benefits to denying long-term problems. You could make, for 20 years, people have been making money in China hoping that the collapse didn't happen while they were invested heavily. Eventually, though, a system like China's is going to have major problems. And I think whether or not Evergrande is the beginning of that, or whether it's simply a portend of things to come, it's a very important sign. And if people miss that, I think that they will eventually regret it.
This is not why you're here to talk, but I'm just interested, since you brought it up and since you do it for a living. What problems do you think China's going to have going forward?
Well, first of all, you can't trust any of the numbers from China. If the government tells you the GDP is X, you can probably bet the GDP is X minus Y. If the government tells you that the debt load on banks is Y, you can probably assume that it's Y plus Z. There's no way to know what any of the information you're getting out of the Chinese government or out of Chinese companies is accurate. This raises another issue.
And has it, over years, have you noticed some of those numbers are demonstrably wrong?
Oh, sure.
Shown?
Sure. Luckin Coffee, just maybe 18 months ago.
The Starbucks
The
imitator.
Starbucks of China it turns out that they were just fabricating numbers for sales, for number of operations they were opening, for all sorts of things. They were just making things up, and a lot of American companies, including, again, BlackRock, got hurt by that.
Interesting. But systemically across the Chinese economy, what do you think the long-term problems are?
Well, the long-term problems are that we're dealing with, it's still a communist country. It's still a country in which decisions about the allocation of capital are made for political reasons as opposed to for capital reasons, for business reasons.
Yeah. And is that noticeable?
I think it's noticeable. The problem is, and this is what I did come to talk about, the book makes the case that we're growing more and more like the Chinese every day, that this becomes a bigger and bigger issue where allocation of capital becomes political as opposed to business oriented. Yeah,
you rarely hear people push back against that. So from the perspective of those of us who are not in business, some of these larger trends are mostly invisible, though everything you've said I sense is true, based on my limited knowledge of it. But our interaction with these big companies takes place at the consumer end or in the media.
Correct.
And we see them saying these things that are just so far beyond the scope of traditional American business thinking that you just wonder, like, who the hell are these people and what are they talking about? And at the heart of a lot of this change is something called environmental social governance, ESG.
Yes.
Right? So this is a principle, and I want to let you explain this since you're the expert, but I want to root our viewers in this with a montage of 3 finance figures talking about why ESG is essential to their plans going forward. Here it is.
I see a situation down the road where CEOs of companies are going to say, I've got 5 buy ratings from equity analysts, my Moody's or S&P bond rating is this, and my ESG rating is this. This is how powerful I think ESG profiles are that will affect the valuation of companies.
Investors incorporating sustainability into their portfolios, thinking about how ESG-related risks may have an impact on their portfolio and therefore on asset pricing. The reality is we believe the category will be $1 trillion by 2030.
Well, I think the one thing that we can all agree on in ESG is it's making the world a better place. It's in a sense like saying world peace, and who can be against world peace?
It goes without saying this is a cross section of some of the worst people in the world. I think that's fair to say. But the last woman I want to just highlight, ESG is an inherently good thing. We're confident we're making the world a better place. It's like world peace. You cannot be against world peace. You cannot be against ESG. That's the kind of level of intellectual rigor they're bringing to this enterprise. Okay, I will stop talking. Tell us what ESG is.
ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance, is the hottest trend in investments in probably 50 years. It's been a really hot trend for the last 5 years. People are dumping money hand over fist into ESG funds. ESG intends to rate companies, to identify companies that are the best buys for investors based on their environmental record, on their social record, and on their governance records. Now, if you ask me, the G is the one that doesn't belong there because governance is important.
Governance of the company itself.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The E and the S are, they're inherently moral positions that have a determined moral outcome that is not necessarily in line with the morality of capitalism. The morality of capitalism,
or the morality of my family,
yep,
for example. I mean, because it's a
absolutely.
very specific. These are not companies working to preserve gun rights, for
Right.
example, or protect the unborn. I mean, this is like they're buying into a political agenda. It sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all political. And what environmental means is sustainability. What the people who are pushing the E in ESG are pushing is for companies that are environmentally sustainable, the companies that are going to be able to survive the transition to net zero carbon emissions, the companies that are preparing for the global climate future.
Okay, so but even environmental is narrowly drawn. I think of myself as probably on the extreme end of environmentalism. Personally, I live in the woods. I love nature. But these aren't people who are trying to stop the clear cutting of forests. This is only about climate, correct?
This is absolutely only about climate. And even with respect to climate, there are tons of different interpretations. So ESG can be anything anybody wants it to be, but ideally it's something that is promoting a better climate future. And ESG is interesting in that it's coercive.
But also it's so broadly defined as to be amorphous. Like it's environment. What does that mean? Who doesn't care about the environment? Social. Who doesn't care about the social good? Everybody does.
Well, Tesla, for example, one would assume that Tesla is a ESG darling. That with moving away from fossil fuels, burning the internal combustion engine, etc., that Tesla would be something that people in ESG are very interested in. But Tesla, in fact, has pretty crummy ESG ratings. And in large part, that's because Elon Musk has resisted reporting their environmental data as opposed to actually doing something for the environment. He's resisted reporting. So he's resisted the bureaucratic nature of ESG, and that has cost him and his company their ESG ratings.
I have too many questions to ask you, and I don't mean to pull you off track. So ESG ratings, there's an actual rating system.
There are several actual rating systems, and none of them are consistent with one another.
Okay.
It's all about who can get into the business, who can take advantage of the market that's demanding this, who can make a little money providing consulting services, and who can take advantage of this idea that people want their investments to make the world a better place.
And by better, you mean more left-wing?
Most of the investors are looking for left-wing, yes.
Okay. So is there any ESG company that's not left-wing? I mean, can you get a high ESG rating by fulfilling a social mission that a conservative would agree with, an environmental mission that a conservative would agree with? A lot of conservative environmentalists out there. Could you kind of get through these gatekeepers intact?
No.
No.
You could create your own gatekeepers,
right?
And there are some funds out there who've just said, our version of ESG has nothing to do with your version, and we don't care what your gatekeepers say. But no, if you were in favor of conservative environmental or conservative social values to try and get through these left-wing gatekeepers, there's not a chance.
Okay. So this is a partisan enterprise, it sounds like.
It's most definitely an ideological enterprise.
Right. Which aligns with one political party but not the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And aligns primarily with the ruling class as well.
Yes, which is indistinguishable from that party, I would say, at this point. It is basically non-ideological. It's the people who have power now would like to retain that power, and this is one of the means they use to achieve that?
Yes, absolutely.
Huh. So tell me about the gatekeepers that we have now for ESG.
Well, there are tons of different gatekeepers. There are rating services. There are proxy advisory services. There are asset management firms. I hate to keep harping on one company in particular, but BlackRock, which is led by Larry Fink, with its $10 trillion in assets under management, has for the last 2 years been telling companies that its primary investment criterion will be sustainability. It's not your balance sheet. It's not, how many customers you think you can get. It's not how well you're doing with respect to creating new products. The only thing that matters, or the thing that matters primarily to BlackRock, is sustainability. And so
sustainability. I mean, these are people who build dollar stores and erect high-density housing and push for mass immigration. I mean,
right.
That's not, none of that is sustainable. All of that is a blot on God's creation. Like, these people hate the environment, but Larry Fink gets to decide what's environmentally sustainable?
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's what he says. And in fact, he has $10 trillion behind him that he gets to push that. And the most frustrating thing about that is that $10 trillion isn't Larry Fink's money. That's my money. That's your money. That's everybody's money. Anybody who has a BlackRock fund in their IRA or their 401k, or who goes out to their advisor and says, put me in BlackRock's tech fund, suddenly he's got your money and he's using it to leverage his political beliefs.
Tell us about Larry Fink. The most powerful person no one knows anything about.
Larry Fink would like very much to be more famous than he is. And I think that we can probably accommodate that. We should make him famous. He should.
I'm enjoying this conversation so much. I just have to pause and tell you that.
He should be more famous because what he is doing is using our money to leverage his political beliefs and to coerce businesses into accommodating his beliefs. Between the three large passive asset management firms, which is BlackRock, which is State Street, and Vanguard, they control over $20 trillion in assets, which amounts to in the neighborhood of 23 to 28% of every single company in the S&P 500. So if you want to introduce an environmental proposal on their annual proxy statement of any company on their annual proxy statement, you can probably count on 25% support from these big three passive management firms, which means you're already halfway there. You don't have to convince that many other people to get on board, and that's how they're leveraging our wealth to advance their political ends in business.
This is like a super micro question, but would wind farms, which have a measurable destructive effect on the actual natural environment and very little upside, would those qualify as environmentally sustainable?
Again, you probably have, it depends on the ratings agency that takes a look at it. I would imagine that there are some who would say, yes, wind is really important. And there were some who would say, yes, wind is really important as long as it's not near Cape Cod.
Right.
And there are some who would say that wind is just, destructive, as you just pointed out.
It certainly is.
So
what about nuclear? Does that qualify, which is, of course, a non-carbon energy generating source?
Again, it's so variable. I think anybody who's serious about reducing carbon emissions, serious about energy for the future, has to consider nuclear, but I'm not sure nuclear fits into the political framework that they want to push.
So this is just
upon
an
us.
enormous bullshit sandwich, basically, is what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good description of it. But it's one that makes them extra money, and so it's one they'd like to keep going for as long as possible.
But in the case of Larry Fink, who runs, again, BlackRock, and for people who don't, it's worth just a trip down the internet for 10 minutes to read about BlackRock. It's an astounding company, really. I mean, just in its scale is astounding. Larry Fink doesn't need to do this for business reasons, so clearly he's a true believer in something. What?
I think Larry Fink is a true believer in Larry Fink. I think that when you look at the people who are pushing some of these environmental plans, some of these ideas, some of the politicization of our capital markets, you get all sorts of motivations. And I think Larry Fink is what in politics or religion they would term a Gnostic. He believes he has the key to saving the world. He believes
a Gnostic,
yes.
Not agnostic,
no,
Gnostic.
A Gnostic, yes. He believes he understands how to save the world, understands how to tame the Chinese Communist Party, how to do all of these things that other people don't understand. He believes that he has the secret, and if people would just shut up and listen to him, he could fix everything.
Do you think if people would just shut up and listen to him, he could fix everything?
Absolutely not. Larry is probably going to end up costing a lot of people a lot of money. When he loses money in Evergrande or loses money in Luckin Coffee, again, that's not his money he's losing. That's mom and pop's money. That's everybody who has a 401k that owns the asset class that has just lost money. So he's not losing his money. He's still going to be a billionaire if Evergrande goes under and takes a huge chunk of BlackRock's money. He's still going to be a billionaire, but mom and pop will lose some.
One of the really striking changes to the American business environment is its wholehearted entry into the most divisive kind of zero-sum race politics. Something I never thought I would see, ever. Even during the bad old days of segregation, companies didn't weigh in on behalf of segregation in the way that they're weighing in on behalf of Black Lives Matter, which is every bit as evil by the same measurements, I would argue. But they are. And Larry Fink is definitely. What is that about, I wonder?
Again, I think it's about control. I think it's about having the right to tell other people what to do. Having the right to make sure that they follow what you think is in their best interest, as opposed to allowing them to decide their best interest for themselves. Interesting.
Let me play you, you're very familiar with this, but just as an example for our viewers. This is Scott Kirby, who's the CEO of United Airlines, one of our biggest, I think it's number 2, big airline, of course, very old airline, on CBS explaining the business imperative of diversifying their pilot ranks. Here he is.
Only 7% of United Airlines pilots are women, one of the highest percentages in the industry. And 13% of its pilots are people of color.
They simply don't have the access or the opportunity.
In an exclusive interview with CBS News, United CEO Scott Kirby is announcing a new effort to bring balance to the flight deck.
We're excited at United to be announcing the United Aviate Academy to address the structural issues with the makeup of our pilots.
There's so many questions. One, why is that guy wearing a mask inside an airplane hangar? But second, what is that? So in a rational world, you would not pay any attention to the color of your pilots because any skin color does not confer expertise. Expertise is measurable. Are you a good pilot or not? they're introducing with maximum aggression and the help of CBS News in a totally irrelevant criterion into their hiring standards. This is a major change in the way our country runs. Why are they doing that?
Well, in large part, it's because they want to buy themselves grace on the cheap. These are people who understand that they're making billions of dollars, understand that they're expanding income equality, understand that what they are doing is, by traditional left-wing standards, truly evil economically. I don't think it's evil. You don't think it's evil. Most people don't think it's evil. Making money is what a company is supposed to do. But because most of them are educated in American schools, educated in American universities, American business schools, they tend to be left-leaning. And so they believe that what they're doing is wrong, and that the only way for them to make up for that is essentially to buy indulgences, to buy grace on the cheap, and to take what social factors they can find and say, hey, look, we're doing good here. Look at us, we're atoning for our sins.
In the case of, I don't know, airline pilots, heart surgeons, structural engineers, I mean, there's certain jobs where you really have to be meritocratic, purely meritocratic in your hiring, or else there are massive safety consequences. If you start hiring pilots on the basis of appearance rather than skill, at some point your planes are going to crash. That's just common sense.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're Scott Kirby, that's not a concern for you?
Well, it should be. I'm not entirely sure why it's not. But if I were running an airline, it would concern me if I were putting people into the cabin based on anything other than their credentials as a pilot. And that means, and that applies to white pilots or blue pilots or green pilots.
It's a matter of the way you think. It should be
absolutely
only based on the relevant criteria. Your appearance has no role in your ability to fly a plane, does it?
No, absolutely none. And the fact that he's putting that at the forefront of his selection criteria is definitely something that makes me uncomfortable. It should make him uncomfortable, and it should make his shareholders uncomfortable.
I got to ask, since you've been studying companies your whole adult life, more than 25 years, sounds like close to 30 years, you look at someone like Scott Kirby, whom I don't know, CEO of United, he's so clearly mediocre and kind of pathetic and dumb and wearing his little mask and all this stuff. How did that guy end up running United Airlines? Or all these people, there's so many, it's not just Scott Kirby, it's like all of them are like that. Who hires them and why?
Well, there is certainly a component of, we see the same thing in the military, where the people who are best able to get along are the ones who stay in the profession or stay in the organization the longest. It doesn't matter necessarily what his skill is in running the company. What matters is his skill in talking to his bosses, in talking to his employees, in talking to shareholders, in sort of putting all of that together and not offending anyone. So he's sort of survived the trial, and that's where he ends up as the head of the organization, because he's gone through the obstacle course.
So the system rewards ass kissers, not ass kickers.
In most corporate situations, absolutely. Larry Fink, as we were just talking about, built his company. Larry Fink should be the CEO of BlackRock as long as he wants to be. Kirby at United is probably not the ideal person to run that airline. He's probably just somebody who managed to get into position because he was able to, as I said, to survive the trials.
So how often, again, as someone whose job it is to study these organizations, these companies, publicly held companies, how often do you see that? You look around at all these CEOs, how often do you see like a really extraordinary person, a leader, an innovator, a builder, someone who's like fully a man, just to be blunt, and how often do you see the Scott Kirby types?
Well, you see more of them more often over the past few years. I think that's probably the direction that American business has moved, and that's part of the problem as well, is that the people who are able to get credentialed and able to survive the obstacle course are the people who end up on the top. There are very few any longer who are truly creative people, and those are the people that we know about. We know Bill Gates,
right?
We know Steve Jobs, we know Larry Fink. We know the people who took their own risks, took the initiative, and built their companies out of nothing. We know those people. largely because there's so few of them.
Interesting. So I look at Citibank.
Right.
I've been around a long time. I think I've got a little Citibank credit card in my wallet. Everyone knows Citibank.
Right.
The person who took over Citibank seems like an idiot to me. Just her internal directives are like 100% political, have nothing to do with banking. I don't know if that's your perception too, but you got to wonder, like a company like that, can that company survive for say 20 years?
Unfortunately, the way the system is rigged, they probably can. The way that they've been able to manipulate the financial system, the way they've been able to manipulate the shareholder system, she will probably survive. The company will probably survive, but it will not perform at an effective measure. It will perform at a less than ideal clip. So it's something that we should be concerned about. But in banking, there are so many different ways to cheat the system that I think that there will probably definitely be a Citibank in 20 years. I can't say as much for all of the S&P 500 companies, but certainly most banking companies will figure out a way to cheat the system. And in fact, we've seen how effectively they do that within the past couple of decades. With the great collapse, they were able to save themselves.
That's right. Because it's not just retail banking. I mean, there's
right. Absolutely.
So, but other of these companies are consumer-facing companies.
Mm-hmm.
Coca-Cola exists because it sells soda. United Airlines exists because you buy plane tickets. So if these companies are taking a position that half or 40% or a third or even 15% of the American population despises, reviles, doesn't that hurt them over time?
It should. Unfortunately, part of the problem is that people are unaware of what's happening. Raising awareness about what American business is doing, how it's doing it, and why it's doing it is one of the reasons that I wrote the book. I want people to understand what's going on in business and what's going on behind the scenes financing business, and to understand how radically political that has become and how dangerous that is to what we understand as America, what we understand as the free enterprise system, the engine that brought America to where it is. This is a tremendous risk, and eventually it will have unpleasant and uncomfortable ramifications.
How free are a lot of conservatives, I should say, have been very slow to criticize corporate America because they believe in free markets, as they often say, free minds and free markets.
Right.
That was somebody's slogan in Washington at some point. And I think most conservatives agree with that. I mean, they don't want heavily regulated markets. They really believe in capitalism in its purest expression.
Right.
Does that system, the free market system, still exist at scale in this country?
It does, but it doesn't really exist in big business. I think that we have gotten to the point where our federal government supports business when they should be supporting markets, which would involve supporting smaller businesses. The overwhelming majority of Americans work at small businesses. The overwhelming majority of Americans buy products from small businesses. And yet small business has almost no political clout. Big business has all the political clout, and big business is basically dragging the government along by its nose.
One of the main victims of the corona hysteria for the past couple of years has been small business.
Absolutely.
So now that the smoke is beginning to clear, what does the picture look like? So it's January 2020, what percentage of the economy was represented by smaller businesses? What do you think that'll look like going forward?
I'm afraid that it's going to be even a lesser percentage every year henceforth, in large part because what we've gotten ourselves into is a system that, and there's some debate among those of us who study this, whether it's a corporatist state or a corporatocratic state. I tend to think...
What's the difference?
A corporatist state would be collusion between business and government in which the government is pulling the strings.
Right.
A corporatocracy would be the same collusion, but business is pulling the strings. I tend to think that we're in what we would call a corporatocracy.
Yes, I agree with that. On the basis of no evidence. Just watching as a daily news consumer. That's what it looks like to me.
I definitely believe that government is doing what business demands of it as opposed to the other way around.
That seems even less healthy than government helping business, or government controlling business, because at least government is theoretically accountable to voters, but
right.
businesses are not.
Right. Well, and that's one of the themes. When I talk about woke capital, as in the dictatorship of woke capital, I use that term to mean the top-down and anti-democratic means by which some of the biggest names in business are trying to change the relationship between the citizen and the state. And so the anti-democratic nature of it is one of the key components to what is going on and why it matters so much.
Tell us how it's anti-democratic.
Well, you and I think, probably started in Washington about the same time,
Yep.
Mid-1990s. Ever since, governments of various Democratic presidents or various Democratic Congresses have been pushing a climate change agenda. They want to cut carbon emissions. They want to have a carbon tax. They want to do, and they've never been successful, in large part because the American people don't want that imposition on their economy. So what?
Have you ever seen polling that suggests a majority of Americans thought climate change was the biggest crisis in their lives?
Absolutely none. In fact, I think, may or may not be in the book, but about the time I was writing the book, I documented some of the numbers, and people think the economy, by at least double, if not triple, is more important than climate change. So if you're going to have to hurt the economy to make any sort of progress on climate change, then what you're doing is essentially against the will of the overwhelming majority of the American people.
And that's called democracy, when you ignore what voters think and do what you and your friends want to do?
No.
Okay. That's
but we've never gotten there through Washington. Washington has never been able to get the climate change agenda that they want. But what our ruling class has figured out is that there's a way to go around the government. There's a way to enact this climate change agenda without having to get the approval of the voters. And that's what ESG is. That's what woke capital is. That's what BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and all of the activist investors are doing, is they're going around the American people. They're taking this into their own hands, saying, we don't really care what you, the American people, want. This is what we think is best for America and for business. And so we're going to make sure that you get this.
It's really upsetting to hear you describe this, because it's so clearly true. What do you think, to the extent you can know, the motive is? Why is it that, climate change is a measurable and presumably debatable phenomenon that we could talk about rationally with reference to scientific data sets, but it's not that. It's clearly this weird dog whistle that certain kinds of people hear, obviously. Why? What is that?
Again, I think it goes back to the idea that they're trying to find some sort of grace on the cheap. Do
you think they believe it, though? Because I listen to some of these people talk about climate who clearly couldn't predict the weather tomorrow. Like, They know nothing about this subject whatsoever. They've never been in nature. They don't know anything other than business. And they really sound like religious converts when they talk about it.
Absolutely. They don't need to understand it. They just need to believe it. I think they believe it as if it were religious dogma. And that's obviously a major problem in that it's no longer something that can be debated or questioned. It's something that is, in fact, gospel, almost literally gospel truth that we must accept and do regardless of whether or not reason or rationality suggests otherwise.
That's great. So we've got religious nuts at the helm.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So back a second. Why did you write this book? I mean, it seems like if your job is to analyze companies and to do it from a position of anonymity for the most part, you and your partner of 25 years, you write this book, and I'm really impressed by how thoughtful your analysis is. You clearly thought a lot about this. Why make this public? Why not make this a report to your clients?
Well, I've been talking about it with my clients, and unfortunately, this is stuff that, until I started investigating this, until I started really diving deeply into this, I didn't know how thoroughly politicized American capital markets had become. And by the time I got sort of a sense of what was going on, it shocked me. And I know that it shocked a number of my clients, and these are large asset managers who've been around in the business a long time. They were surprised as well. And I figured that if it's something that surprised me and it's something that surprised them, it's something that the American people definitely need to know about.
You do it for a living, they do too, and neither of you understood
Right.
its magnitude.
Right, and the people need to know what's going on. We need to make sure, raising awareness seems to be, a cliche that the left uses all the time, but we definitely need to raise awareness about this issue and make sure that people understand that this is taking place.
Is anyone pushing back against it?
Well, I don't think they see us yet as significant enough to do so. If you look, for example, at who is out there filing shareholder resolutions, which is one way that they advance their political beliefs with companies, is to pass shareholder resolutions that change the way these companies are supposed to behave. If you look at the people who are writing them, who are funding them, who are passing them, you're looking at probably 200 organizations on the left and one on the right. The Free Enterprise Project at the National Center for Public Policy Research is the only organization doing this from a conservative perspective. So I don't think they think of us as a threat. I think they think of us as, sort of a reactionary joke at this point.
What about asset managers? Do any of them say, this is too stupid, I'm not participating?
Well, certainly a lot of them do, but here's another one of the problems. I mentioned earlier that proxy advisory services are part of the problem. There are two proxy advisory services in this country that dominate the market. They're Glass Lewis and ISS, which is Institutional Shareholder Services. And every year when these asset managers have to vote on shareholder resolutions, they have to vote on whether or not to retain the CEO, whether or not to retain the board, etc. They're supposed to do what's called due diligence and look at all of these shareholder resolutions and figure out what's in the interest of their clients, etc. But because there are so many companies and they hold so many companies and they have so many different funds, it's nearly impossible for every asset manager to go through every company and every shareholder resolution. So seeing a niche in the market that they could fill, these two companies, these two proxy advisory services said, look, we'll do the due diligence and we'll tell you how to vote. Well, both of these companies are radically left-wing, and what they're doing is they're telling asset managers what you want to do is vote for X, what you want to do is vote against Y, and they're almost entirely left-wing proposals that they're having them vote for, and more conservative or more status quo proposals that they're having them vote against. So the proxy advisory services, who also make a ton of money on consulting, telling companies how best to become ESG friendly, a major conflict of interest, are driving the way asset managers vote. And they're driving them to the left without most of these asset managers even realizing it.
The takeover is complete.
Yeah, it's fairly thorough. In the introduction to the book, I refer to it as Carl Sandburg's onion, where you peel a layer and there's another layer and another layer and another layer. And just when you think you've got a handle on what's going on, there's something else that they're doing that is just radically affecting the way capital markets and business function.
So let's say you've got a little bit of dough you'd like to invest, but you have sincere beliefs and values, and you don't want your investments to undermine those beliefs and values. Like, let's say you really care about your family and you want your kids to grow up in the country that you did. Where do you invest your money?
That's a good question. There are a handful of funds that have been developed over the past couple of years that are attempting to push back at this, against this. There are a handful of retail wealth advisors that are attempting to put together portfolios to push back against this. And there are a handful of very small asset managers who are doing the same. But there are not very many of them. They're not very large. They're not very well known. And so it's very difficult to find investments where you can say, hey, I'm just going to put my money here, you take care of it, you manage it, but you do it in conjunction with my values. It's very difficult at this point. Even if you have, say, BlackRock funds. Your advisor has you in BlackRock funds, and you say, well, keep me out of ESG. Keep me out of the ESG funds, I don't want to be in it. Simply by having a BlackRock fund, that your wealth is going to be used to vote for sustainability, because that's what Larry Fink has said, has all of its assets, not just its ESG assets, all of its assets are going to be used to push this agenda. So, it's extremely difficult at this point, and it's very very much a market that needs more people who are willing to put their reputations on the line to fight for what is right.
I have to ask you, just in closing, since you do this for a living and we don't have a lot of people in the studio with your background, we should probably have more. Where do you see the American economy in 5 and then 10 years from now?
Well, not in good shape. What the amount of debt that we've taken on in the past 18 months or so is extremely worrisome. We've already started to see some of the effects of that with inflation. We get the Fed chairman saying yesterday that now he doesn't believe that inflation is transitory, that some of these inflationary pressures are here to stay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm not even a Fed chairman, and that was obvious to me
Yeah, well,
6 months ago.
It was obvious to most people, but the Fed chairman. And so what we're going to end up with, most likely, is something like the stagflation that sort of gripped the economy in the late 1970s. The catch is that there's nobody with the guts that Ronald Reagan had to come along and say, look, we need to end inflation by raising rates, and it doesn't matter how badly it hurts us in the short term, we will get there eventually. There are no politicians who have the guts to do what Reagan did, because that almost cost him his reelection. And so it's going to be very difficult to find people with the political will to push monetary policy back in the direction that it needs to go. And it's going to be a very rough 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years.
What do you mean by very rough?
I think we're going to have inflation. I think we're going to have low growth. I think eventually we'll get to lower employment. We're going to have issues with investments not returning as much as we had hoped they would, because they're being invested in companies based on non-pecuniary factors, based on political factors. So I think that we're going to get hit with a number of different weapons from a number of different angles that are going to cause some serious problems for a lot of Americans.
What if we imported millions of poor people with low educational standards at that exact moment? Would that help or hurt?
I don't think that would probably help very much.
You don't think it would help?
No.
Why are they doing it?
Again, that's an excellent question. It's I think it's to soothe their consciences, to tell themselves that they're good people despite everything else that they do.
Is there any way that we could move all of these social ills to Aspen and Martha's Vineyard?
Well, if we could, I think that'd probably be a good idea.
What an interesting conversation that was. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Amazing.
I appreciate it.
Amazing. This is one of those segments. This is probably the only segment we've done so far where I wasn't directly involved in it. You just showed up on my list. I was like, oh, this should be interesting, and it was really interesting.
Well, good. I'm glad.
I'm grateful that you came.
I'm glad you had me.
Very much.
Hopefully this will be good for both of us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Tucker Carlson Today is the name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on Fox Nation. We will see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.